So a fun but serious insight, or very insightful episode for many of the girls, but especially Heather, whose mother we get to meet for the first time. And boy, was that interesting. Plus Emily's appearance on Watch What Happens Live, giving us some more insight behind the scenes of this show and the season in general. All that and more in this 12th episode of season 16 of Real Housewives of Orange County. Recap and react. If you are here live, make sure to say hello in the live chat wherever you are, and make sure to share your thoughts as we go along. And for those of you on the replay, make sure to say hello as well wherever you are tuning in from. And with that said, let's jump right in to this recap and react, starting with a quick scene from Noella catching us up on the status of her divorce, where she says that she actually saw a charge from her soon-to-be ex, James, in Orange County at Mastro's, where she said she actually thought that she might show up and surprise him with their son, just to be like, hey, remember us? But I guess she never did it, or we would have seen it, or she would have probably bragged about it. But we are now quickly with Jen and Emily, who are working out in the picturesque Corona Del Mar, it looked like, which is, or maybe Laguna Beach, but it looked like Corona Del Mar to me, which is right next to Newport Beach, where they're catching up before the cooking party Shannon is hosting that evening, which we will see a little bit later. But Jen says she's excited to learn to cook something because she thinks Ryne will appreciate it. But Emily chimes in saying, caution, I've recently burned dino nuggets somehow, even though I thought you could just microwave them and be fine. But side note on this, I don't know if I would be bragging about not being able to even cook chicken nuggets that are frozen. My question to you is this something to be proud of, or should you use your inability to cook as a personality trait or a quirk? Let me know what you think. But then Jen jokes that maybe she should have Ryne go to the party for her to learn how to cook for her. But if last episode is any indication, which I'm sure you watched and heard, if you didn't watch, then Ryne should probably stay away from the cameras at this point and any of Jen's female friends. Probably a good idea. But anyways, Jen then gives a more serious update on her and Ryne, where she says they're kind of at a stalemate at this point because he thinks that what will fix this is being equal partners in the relationship financially. Jen clarifies that this is all stemming from the fact that Jen bought their Hawaii house prior to them actually getting married. And Emily asks her, do you think this is really going to solve the problems? And Jen says, maybe. But in her confessional, Emily makes a very good point in saying, from her legal perspective, that Ryne wanting to have everything in his name or be a co-signer or co-owner of all the things that he isn't right now is potentially the first step in Ryne wanting to leave Jen and take a big payout on the way out. So I don't know if we didn't see her say this to Jen, but I wonder if she did say anything. But anyways, Jen then shares her idea of having Ryne actually move out and get what she called a VBRO, which I think she meant VRBO or Verbo, which is like the Airbnb rental thing. But her idea is to have him move out for a month as they go to counseling twice a week during that month and do a date night once a week as well during that month, and then go from there to see what happens. But Emily seems to be on board with this because it's them trying to fix their marriage, and Emily says she always errs on the side of wanting to fix it before going to the easy thing to do in society, which is just to get a divorce, because Emily thinks people divorce too easily, and she sees it as not always the easiest option long term because it creates this whole other set of problems, from the contentious divorce, the terms of the divorce, all the paperwork and the legal stuff, plus the co-parenting, and then having to be single again. And if you want to be in a relationship at some point, you have to go back into the dating scene with what they describe as douches driving Lambos wearing wigs. So there was that. But I think I trust Emily's legal opinion on this one, even though my first thought was it makes sense that Ryne would want to be financial partners in this family property that they all share together. But probably would have been better to bring that up maybe years ago or even before you get married. But one thing I saw as well regarding Ryne was, in general, the comments about Ryne and his appearance on the show One, that Ryne apparently doesn't watch the show, according to Jen's Watch What Happens Live appearance a few weeks ago, but a lot of people are saying they think him being shirtless all the time and having Mr. Puppers, his Chihuahua dog, always with him, are security blankets or kind of coping things to distract people from his potential insecurities, whether that be maybe some of the physical features, meaning his face is what I've been seeing referenced as something maybe he's not as secure about, so he kind of uses his body to kind of distract people so they look away from that. Or the dog, if he has a shirt on, because people look at a dog and say, oh, that's kind of weird to see a dog there. Or, and also the conversation then turns away from him not being the breadwinner of their household. Let's just call it like it is. So let me know what you think of that interpretation of everything regarding Jen and her husband. With that said, let's keep going to now seeing, well, after this, we saw Gina struggling to get out the door to catch her ride in a car to take her to the private airport hangar with Heather and her two oldest kids to head to New York for a family/college/work/play trip. Gina explained to us from the normal folk perspective how traveling private is different. Mostly the difference is that you don't have to follow the same rules as everyone else regarding going through TSA and getting your luggage checked. You basically show up in this private lounge. Whoever's in charge of the luggage takes it and she doesn't know what happens with it and somehow it gets on the plane and you just walk right up to the plane, which does seem very nice. So they arrive in New York, and as they head into town, Heather is remembering all these things from her time at Syracuse University, including her big 80s hair, which we saw some pictures of in the episode. And after everyone settles in, Gina is then taken out on the town with Heather, reminiscing about her days of partying, trying to say to Gina that 31 years ago when she was in college, that she didn't have a fake ID or try to get into a bar underage. At least that was the impression she was giving to Gina, trying to keep that veneer of Heather's curated image that she has come to be known for. But in her confessional said her fake ID was actually rejected at all these places, and unless Heather was trying to give the impression that, or trying to get away from the impression that her fake ID wasn't good enough, I don't know why she didn't see that to Gina's face, because I think also she didn't say that to Gina's face because it would imply that Heather wasn't so perfect at something. Even though I would argue that faking an ID is not the best thing to brag about being good at, in my opinion, but this whole thing was kind of questioning the typical Heather brand, if you will. But they get into the bar, and Heather is now briefing Gina on what's going to happen in the next few days, which we'll see coming up in a few seconds. But we get a little bit more insight into Gina's life growing up and how she has one brother who was kind of the smart, successful one who went into business and got the good grades and went to school. And she contrasted that with herself, who took the more marriage, motherhood route, but somehow she came around to now being in the business space and now on her way to presumably a lot of success, which she shares similar to how she did last week when they were doing the closet clean out scene, in that in college, which they're referencing here and they're kind of talking about, she met her husband Matt, and then she thought her life would look a lot different than it is now. But this whole scene was good because we got to learn a little bit more about them. But they now go to the next day where Heather is now touring the university with her son Nick and her daughter Max. It's raining. We get more insight into Heather and her kids, mostly that Nick wants to be studying business and Max wants to study psychology, where Heather then makes a point to say she doesn't want her kids to feel pressured to follow in her footsteps exactly, but wants them to make their own path. I don't know if I personally believe Heather when she says that, but they do go and take a pic in front of Heather's sorority house, which had a little welcome sign for her. And more backstory to Heather, we learned that after graduating from Syracuse, studying theater, musical theater, she wanted to be on Broadway, but she actually got a call to do a gig on Divorce Court at the time. So she flew to LA, and then from there she just continued working as an actress in Hollywood. And then she met Terry, and then that's where we are now with everything that happened after that. But as usual, Heather's kids are busting her balls about a few things when she's describing kind of the sorority house and the sorority and how it works. But later in the evening, we then see Heather is recording her podcast live at the Alumni Association of Syracuse University, where the parts of her speech we see are her sharing more of her story of her journey in Syracuse and how much it grew her as a person, and how being in this new competitive environment really forced her to grow up and learn a lot of new skills, including, well, she said also she gained 30 pounds instead of the freshman 15, which I thought was funny, but, and don't we all, but she said how entering the Greater Miss Syracuse pageant and winning was the spark of really loving performing and honing those skills of interviewing and thinking on her feet and presentation. And she credits that experience to a lot of her success now. So we'll get back to the New York thing in a second, but I just want to react to this really quick. First, nothing says my parents are rich like wearing a Givenchy t-shirt to college as Nick did in this scene. I thought that was an interesting choice, but I wonder if he'll continue wearing that kind of stuff in college when he gets there. But the trip so far, though, overall, I think is nice to see from Heather, because we get to learn more about her backstory that maybe we didn't learn when she was originally on the show. And we did get another product placement, unfortunately, with this live podcast recording, although this one wasn't as bothersome to me as all the other ones this season so far, because to me it did fit in well with this whole storyline. And I thought it was a smart plug, in my opinion, in this part, because it was a little more in the background, but it was the vehicle to get us to learn more about Heather and her past. And of course, I think it was Heather's idea to do this speech and say it's a live podcast recording. I don't know if the Alumni Association actually asked her to do that, as she was saying, but also it does make sense because this is a part of a trip of Heather's alma mater and her kids considering going to college there. Plus, Gina is from New York and went to college in New York. And the podcast is the result of her time on The Real Housewives originally, which was the result of her acting career stemming from Syracuse, where she got her training. So it does make more sense here. And this was basically the intersection of her entire life in this moment because of what I said, the theater training, her acting, meeting Terry after college, and now returning with the kids that she had with Terry. But one thing I was disappointed in learning was that last week's episode with Heather and Gina cleaning out her closet, where Heather brought over that pink jacket and had her try it on and say, oh, look at this is all the cool things you can do with it. It ended up being a product placement from Heather. After all, even though it wasn't mentioned on the show, apparently they cut that part out, or maybe she didn't say it. And I saw this on Juicy Scoop with Heather McDonald, her recent episode, which I'll link at the end of this episode. She said some sleuth on Twitter or something did the research and found the jacket, that it was Heather's. So unfortunately, another product placement. But at this point, it does look like her contract somehow to return to the show must have included her being allowed to film whatever product placement she wanted and then just leave it up to whoever edits these to leave it in or not. And then I guess at that point, it's up to Heather to be really smart about her product placement so that it's basically forced to be on the show, or else we don't have a show. But I will give her a lot of credit because a lot of credit for how many product placement things she's been able to fit in the season so far. And kudos to Terry and Heather for even having that many businesses going on. I don't blame them for that. Even though I may be getting more annoyed with each one that's coming because I'm not the target audience, it's also, I think, a lot of people who aren't even the target, or are the target audience, that are also getting annoyed from what I've been seeing around the interwebs. So time will tell if Heather and Terry overplayed their hand as far as the product placement, but it's a good lesson for all of us that if we're annoyed by this much product, maybe we shouldn't do it ourselves on our feeds or our platforms. Anyways, they are now heading back to Manhattan after the speech. And once they arrive and settle in, they FaceTime Shannon and the girls at their cooking party. But we're going to hold that FaceTime thought for a second, and we're going to get into the cooking party at Shannon's house and all that ensued there. So back in Orange County, Shannon is prepping for the evening, entertaining Noella, Jen, and Emily, This is much more, according to a few episodes ago, in Shannon's wheelhouse as far as entertaining at night rather than during the day or at lunchtime. But now the girls arrive and Emily is compares Shannon's with her chef's hat to the Swedish chef on the Muppets, which was a little subtle shade to Shannon, but I don't know if she meant it that way or she meant it as a compliment. Who knows? But Shannon then slightly pushes back and kind of punishes them by making them wear chef's coats and hairnets on their head. And they take a picture. That was pretty funny. But what was even funnier than this was actually the exit by the two girls that were helping Shannon prep for this situation. They exited out the back door to her backyard, which I thought was interesting. They didn't go out the front door or in the garage. They just went to the backyard. So I wonder if they were just hanging out there during this whole thing. Maybe they snuck around the side. I don't know. Or that footage was actually cut from earlier before the girls arrived and they just had to make it make sense, showing them leaving somehow. I don't know. But one more thing I want to say before we keep going is I thought it was interesting that Shannon chose to get some people to help her prep for this event, because the whole premise of this event was supposed to be Shannon showing the other girls how to cook these easy, quick meals. And so if I had walked into a cooking party with the intent of being able to do it myself or DIY what the host or teacher is going to teach us, and then I walk in and they have two people helping them, I would be a little confused and probably call BS in my brain if this is actually as easy as you're telling me it was. But anyways, let's keep going. So they start cooking and it doesn't seem as easy as they were told by Shannon. But of course, Shannon, like everything she does, is very serious and focused and in the zone. And everyone else is kind of joking at first. But they actually end up cooking with Shannon. And at the end, before they eat, they're all trying to figure out how to pass this task off to their kids to do. Jen's like, you know what? I have 3 kids. I'm going to make one of them, each of them cook a different night of the week, which I thought was kind of funny and smart. But as they are eating their meal, and as Emily is sharing her interaction with Gina and Heather before they went to New York, Noella then spits out her quote-unquote uncooked shrimp in the cloth napkin, which she seems to be most embarrassed by spitting it out into a cloth napkin, not the fact that she's basically saying, like, insulting whoever made the shrimp, which happened to be Jen. Now, Jen in her confessional calls BS on this because she says there was only one shrimp that was not cooked all the way, and it happened to be the one Noella ate that Jen cooked. Of course, we know Jen and Noella historically are not getting along at this point, but we'll never know for sure if that was actually undercooked or she did it for dramatic effect. But then I thought to myself, I was like, can't you eat shrimp raw? Like, I'm pretty sure when you have like shrimp cocktail and stuff, isn't the shrimp raw? Or am I mistaken? Or is the shrimp cooked, but it just looks, I don't know, whatever. But I mean, it's just fish. Maybe not. Maybe I was thinking something else. But anyways, Shannon is now trying to call Heather because this is happening at the same time as Heather and Gina in New York. But it goes to voicemail where everyone else is like, oh, maybe they're busy. But Noella takes it upon herself to try to poke at Shannon by saying, oh, it looks like you got blocked, which was actually a soundbite that was in the trailer for the season. And it looks like it ended up just being a soundbite that was used for shock value and completely out of context in the trailer, because clearly she was joking and it didn't really mean anything. But they talk then about more sexual things, which is typical now with Noella. And one thing I wanted to note was this angle right here. Look at this. If you're not watching on YouTube, then I'll try to explain it. But here, Shannon was holding her phone as they were talking about this, and now she was trying to call Heather. And it always looked like she was going to burn it in the candle because of the angle of where the candle was and how she was holding her phone. And I kept being kind of freaked out by this and had to watch the scene like 4 times to not be distracted by that and like figure out what was going on. But anyways, let's keep going. So they finally contact via FaceTime Heather and Gina in New York, which we mentioned earlier. And following that FaceTime with all the girls, Noella was a little disconnected as they hung up, and Emily then brings up to Shannon the jealous of Gina conversation again. And Emily tries to justify Gina's quote-unquote ego, which is what Shannon is claiming it is, as saying maybe Gina has the right to have an ego right now in her life because she came off such a bad couple years and now she has a lot to celebrate and she's happy. So why can't she be how she's being? And Shannon at this point is still not backing down to her view of Gina and having this ego, and basically says to put a pin in it, and is continually defending herself as not jealous. So we're gonna have to see how that keeps going. But before the party turns up, Jen is trying to leave early, explaining her situation she told Emily earlier in the episode, which we all heard, about Ryne moving out and them trying to work through their issues. But under her breath, Noella is saying, well, we all have things going on. Why does she have to leave early? Blah, 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 blah. And in her confessional, Noella is now saying that we all have problems. We all have relationship issues. But this is supposed to be sorority, and we're supposed to be here to support you, and you want to be with us, and blah, 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 blah. But Jen then says in her confessional that Noella's comments only made her basically want to leave more because, in my opinion, a sorority sister would be supportive of what your sorority sister wants, meaning Jen. And so this whole stance from Noella, in my opinion, was very confusing again, and supported what Emily said before about Noella wanting to receive the support but doesn't want to give it. And like I said, in here, this scene, Noella should be supporting Jen and wanting her to go save her marriage because she has the chance to, which I thought was Noella's stance with her marriage before, of not being given the chance to save her marriage by being blindsided by James. But now she says she wants this group to support her, Noella, but then makes this comment to Jen not in support of what Jen wants. Before it was Noella was blindsided, but now it is, oh, I had issues in my marriage when it's convenient to diminish the feelings of Jen, who is someone that she's butted heads with ever since a few weeks ago when Noella was shut down by the group for pushing the divorce narrative on Jen as she was sharing all this with everyone in the group. So now I guess Noella's just against Jen every time marriage talks come up. The sorority comments were also interesting considering the group should be supportive of Jen leaving early if the excuse is, I'm going to go continue to be married. And Emily said on Watch What Happens Live, she thinks Noella whispered that on purpose to kind of poke at Jen because she's still mad at her about what happened a few weeks ago at this house, ironically, at the luncheon hosted by Shannon. And also, I finally put my finger on who Noella reminds me of, and it seems like she's a mix of Bronwyn and Vicky Gunvalson, because in this scene, the comment from Noella about Jen not being the only one with problems came off to me as something Vicky would have said to Gretchen or Alexis in years past. And then the sex talk part of Noella, which is kind of confusing and also like Bronwyn. That's the Bronwyn part, is the confusing sex talk. And we know now that Noella has actually been friends with both Vicky and Bronwyn in the past. So it isn't a stretch to say that she emulates them in some way. Also, you could tell in this scene that Jen was taken back by Noella's comments and kind of just like, why would you say that? Like, not now. And kind of avoiding confronting Noella at this point and just wants to leave, even though Emily says, oh, you can't leave mad. But clearly Jen couldn't take any more BS at this point, considering she probably felt like her life was falling apart at this moment. But anyways, let's keep going to kind of the end of this whole duel scene of some of the girls for the girls in Orange County and then 2 in the Big Apple, if you will, where we're seeing Gina and Heather now gallivanting through the streets of New York, eating pizza, dancing in the rain, while in the OC, everyone besides the departed Jen is in the pool now, where Noella has her boobs out, Emily's only in her underwear, and Shannon is pantless with her chef's coat and hat still on, but the only naked one in the pool is the dog Archie. So, quick reaction to all of this scene, which is, I was thinking that last week, Gina maybe kind of towards the end of her time on the show, because she was kind of wrapping up some of her old storyline regarding her ex and her life. But her friendship with Heather, as highlighted in this episode, appears to be breathing new life into her time on the show. And also, I think it's bringing out a more likable, relatable side to Heather. So just wanted to point that out. But it is now the next morning, and Shannon is waking up to a frat house, or sorority house, I guess in this case, of a mess, trying to recall if she took the edibles that are all unwrapped on the table, or if it was Noella, who is now on FaceTime with Shannon, kind of all making sense of what happened from the night before, where they're all kind of hurting, because I guess they drank a lot after Jen left and we saw them in the pool. I will say, overall, I liked how this episode was, and we still have more to go, but how this episode was put together, because the entire cast had a girls' night out, basically, in 2 separate cities, but it was tied together by them all doing it in the same night, and while also building that tension for the Shannon versus Heather and Gina storyline. So I thought it was a really good episode in that way. But on to a more serious note, and a scene with Jen, who is now with the therapist Tina, who was the therapist we've seen before in years past with Shannon and David. It was that creepy retreat where they role played as being dead and their spouse had to like talk to them as if they were at their funeral, which was really, really, really weird. And it was also mentioned a few weeks ago at Shannon's house by Jen saying, "Oh, that's the same girl I went to," which clearly she wasn't lying about. But Jen was also solo in this therapy session. And while Jen said she felt rejected by Ryne not being there, Tina says it isn't a loss because you, Jen, also brought baggage and wounds from your childhood into this relationship, and you can resolve those things without Ryne here. Long story short, Jen says her criticizing herself does affect her family seeing that, and they may be interpreting it as criticism of them, even though that wasn't her intent. And Jen says at the end, losing Ryne would feel like losing her dad all over again, and she does not want to go through that pain again. So she's clearly very determined to make this work. Of course, Ryne is very uncomfortable being on camera, so we'll see how this all works out. But we are now back in New York, and this is the scene that was pretty interesting to see, which is us getting introduced to Heather's mother at dinner, who gives us a lot of insight as to who Heather is and why she is the way she is. Her mom, in the span of a few minutes, was complaining about her seating, telling the kids to get off their phone. She wanted to order first. She actually rearranged the table setting and did it in front of the waitress, saying, "See, that is how you set a table." And it's like, yikes. And she had a very specific order for her martini and for her food. And while Heather wants to say she's only a little bit similar to her mom, Gina says in her confessional, this explains a lot about Heather. And her mom isn't letting Heather get away with distancing herself from her either. But we then get to meet Gina's parents at this dinner too, and get to see the differences between the parents, where Gina points out how her parents are very easygoing compared to Heather's mom from what they see, and kind of go with the flow, where then the similarities between her parents and Heather's are pointed out by Heather's mom and saying that Gina clearly was raised properly, indicating or kind of giving herself a pat on the back for her parenting, but also kind of subtle shade at Heather's parenting. Luckily, Max and Nick were at the other end of the table and probably didn't hear their grandma say that, even though the editing, they tried to trick us to make us think that everyone is hearing everything at the table, which we know in restaurants is very, very much not the case all the time. But then Heather and her mom are talking, and Heather's mom says, nowadays, people aren't raised with ethics. And Heather goes, yeah, we used to nickname you Smother, not Mother. And then they go into a back and forth where Heather and her mom are talking about the differences and contrast to how they grew up versus how Heather is raising her kids. And Heather is basically defending her stance as a parent, saying, look how great my kids turned out. They're at the other end of the table. Okay, let's react to this. First, I agree with the take from Heather's mom about the immorality becoming more common in society. I don't know if, especially my offline life, I don't know if it's because it's happening more often or we just are more aware of it. But Heather's mom, in other aspects, especially ordering and comments at the table, were a lot to handle. But I kind of like it when people stand up to Heather. the same way that Noella and Shannon doing so at the beginning of the season and Noella now. We're doing it because they normally annoy me. But when you stand up to Heather Dubrow and kind of put her in her place, I think it's always a good thing. But I could also tell they picked the worst moments of her mom at this dinner because you can see her in the background laughing and engaging in some of the frames. So we have to kind of give editing a little bit of the blame here. But I always like learning more about the cast, including seeing Gina's parents and how funny it was to see Heather trying to distance herself from being similar to her mom, even though I think we all see the similarities just in this really quick scene. And Heather, I don't think, is really fooling anybody at this point. And her mom seems to have the same traits as her kids and trying to bust her balls, pretending she is something that maybe she is not. All right, we're going to conclude this episode with the debrief of that last dinner scene with Heather and Gina having drinks by themselves, where Heather is filling in Gina about her mom really having a tough time since her dad passed away a few years ago. And then we get an Emily FaceTiming them from dinner with Shane after the night before dinner party, where she's like, I can't believe I'm even alive after what happened the night before. But they're all kind of discussing how they all felt the weird vibes, as we kind of saw on camera, where with that FaceTime between them when they're all at the table and they FaceTime Gina and Heather. And Emily reports back about the jealousy conversation that ensued after they hung up the FaceTime, where Gina says Gina is filled in on Shannon telling the group that Gina needs to deflate her ego, where Heather and Emily are now defending Gina's confidence and success. And Gina finally just says what we've all been thinking, which is Shannon is not your friend. Because a friend would be happy to see you happy, especially after being around and in your life the past few years when you've been really down. And Gina makes a good point in saying that a truly happy Shannon would not be acting this way. And I completely agree with her on this. But we get a final throwback to years past where there was a competition of who can have the most fun between the Tres Amigas and Heather on a vacation many, many years ago. And it appears the same thing is happening now, but just with different players on each side of the Heather versus Shannon thing. So I just wanted to quickly say, heart goes out to Heather's mom. I think anybody who is widowed and having a difficult time with the passing of a spouse, I mean, you can't help but feel for them, because I can't imagine how that feels. But let's get to Emily's Watch What Happens live appearance. There's a few other notable things that happened during that, which was apparently Emily says she knew of the Gina and Heather New York trip before the Cabo trip we saw a few weeks ago, which doesn't line up with the timeline we were given on the show, because we saw Heather and Gina go to lunch after they got home, after they got home from Cabo, meaning they probably planned going on that trip before, but they didn't film it. So at that lunch, they probably scheduled that for production to get it on camera to kind of set up this entire trip, which is important. And maybe even that lunch might have been filmed way after, who knows, or at the very end of filming, just to kind of fill in the gaps when they were editing, who knows. But that, to me, and why that's important, is it indicates that Heather is willing in the production area, just like everyone else on the show, to kind of play it up for the cameras. So she's not completely as genuine and innocent as she wants us all to believe. But also Emily said in this appearance that Shannon talks more off camera than about everyone else than what people think. And she's very smart about what she says on camera and off camera to kind of play a little victim and try to be more innocent than she actually is. So I thought that was an interesting little tidbit, which we kind of got an insight to this at the very beginning of the season with the whole lawsuit thing. Because remember, that was brought up by Shannon to Emily and Gina when they were out at Javier's before they started filming without any cameras. And Gina was the one who brought it up on camera and kind of told Heather about that. And it kind of blew up the whole beginning of the season, and now we're leading to this. So, and of course, the threat and promise from Heather to Shannon shut her up a little bit. But there was no after show posted by Bravo about this episode yet as of me filming right now. So that's what we have have to work with. So with that said, make sure to give me any of your thoughts in the comment section or live chat wherever you are tuning in, especially if you're on the replay. Make sure to do whatever you got to do to to not miss another episode, whether that's subscribing or following or adding. And if you liked this episode, make sure to like it, thumbs up, upvote, rate this podcast, or whatever you got to do to show some love. And I will talk to you in the next one. Bye-bye.